Hey, thank you for coming to my talk about Israel-Palestine. I call it Israelpolitik. This is about a lot of certain things and not about many other things, right? So I'm talking about the state of Israel in the context of international relations and global politics, as opposed to many other angles we could come at it with. This is a slide from my last talk I want to show to kind of situate the progression here, because I propose these things are really connected. The epistemic environment we all grow up in Western society, not that it's homogenous, but it's very skewed, it's very captured, and that's the paradigm drift. That's before we even get to the systemic conspiracy elements of it. I'm going to make a clear distinction here, because I'm not talking about any conspiracy theories about Israel or Judaism in this talk, although I could in the broader context and debunk a lot of it and explore some of it. But I'm talking about Israelpolitik as part of systemic conspiracy. So those are the two talks I've given, and then the next talk is communism, right? And that relates as well, because Israel has kibbutzes. Karl Marx was Jewish. So there's a tension and a paradox between Jewish communism and Jewish capitalism, or the left and the right. So that's the foregrounding. So what is Israelpolitik? It's many things, as you're going to see. So this slide says a little bit what it's not. I'm quickly gonna, forgive me here, just jump over to this website that I made. It's an interface that, so, I developed 20 concepts that kind of are constitutive of Israelpolitik. And I'm not going to go through this. This is more back end, and this is stuff that's going to be in my book. But here's a basic example of like how I came up with the term, like Realpolitik and Israel and kind of a Zionist fusion, and related to U.S. Realpolitik. And, we can think of the Iraq War as an example. Like, Realpolitik means you're taking a pragmatic or real approach as opposed to idealistic. But when it's based on lies like the WMDs, C. Wright Mills in the 50s called that, and the Cold War mentality, he called that crackpot realism. So I'm taking a critical stance, defining this Israelpolitik as a very systemic and complex process, and normalized status quo, post-truth geopolitics, right? That's part of the environment the United States has created. What Israel and Israelpolitik is it's not merely a state. It's not merely, the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. It's a transnational political formation that connects to state strategy, diaspora institutions, lobbying, media framing, donor networks, security doctrines. And where I'm going with all that is that the military-industrial complex, puts us in a state of fear and having to cope and react to various forces in more violent ways. We need to think very, like, in subtle and diffuse terms about how power operates, not just through, the idea of a particular state trying to survive. It's not merely an ideology, various intersecting ideologies. It's careers, funding, legitimacy, prestige, and we'll get to, the asymmetries, and especially the asymmetry of money, how much money funds ideology. And it's not merely a conflict. Even the term Israel-Palestine conflict has been problematized extensively by a wide range of people. And frankly, a lot of the terminology is very problematic. It becomes a test case for empire, right? American exceptionalism, the limits of liberalism. There's so much terminology here to unpack. On my list of terms here, I have settler colonial capitalism, but there's other terms I'm trying to avoid, like the sort of trope of a white European settler colonial project. I want to stress that there's some truth in all of those terms. It just gets very muddied. And so we need to be super precise, right? Because Zionists do have a lot of diversity. Israelis have a lot of diversity. There's a lot of ethnic diversity serving in the Israeli military. So it's by no means reducible to a white supremacist project, but it's heavily linked to white supremacy in the United States through Christian nationalism, to say the least. Right. And so I'm not even going to talk about Christian nationalism in this talk. There's no space for it. But I will just say there are 80 million Christian Zionists in the United States, and they, hold enormous sway and enormous power. And there's also a lot of progressive Christians and anti-Zionist Christians. So there's a split there. And that's what I'm going to be talking about in the context of the Jewish split. Before I go any further, though, why me? Who am I? And I think there's some strengths and weaknesses with this, right? So, I have no attachment of any kind to that part of the world, to any religion, but because of my background in international relations, I think I have a lot of valid perspective to share, and to ground it in different things than it's traditionally grounded, right? To ground it in geopolitics, power, and statecraft. And specifically, going back to 2008, I read newspaper clippings from the 1890s about, Jewish people debating in the paper, what is this political Zionism? And so it was hotly debated at the time. I think Jews were evenly split. And there was also advocacy for cultural Zionism and kind of diasporic Zionism. And so that's very different from having a Jewish state. Karl Marx was against the idea 50 years before political Zionism even emerged. And I gravitated towards this topic because in international relations, it's one of the biggest, not just geopolitical conflicts, but epistemic conflicts, right? Like, how do we even get knowledge about this subject? And so I wrote a paper in 2009 called Israelpolitik, and it focused on mainly the debates and career, collisions of Norman Finkelstein and Alan Dershowitz. They're both Jews. Finkelstein's grandparents were killed in the Holocaust. They both have a claim to this discourse, but they're diametrically opposed. And then I was accepted into the University of Chicago IR program to work on this sort of topic, but I chose a different university instead and a different topic, in part because I thought, well, two things. Who am I to get involved with this? But more importantly, I thought, I was so inspired by the progressive discourse and the radical discourse and the way decolonial struggle was linked to Palestinian liberation. And if Palestine's not free, none of us are free. I thought, can I really even contribute that much? And I think maybe my novelty would be better spent elsewhere. And then I could keep Israelpolitik in the, in the back burner, on the shelf as a kind of case study. And funnily enough, I look back on my paper as quite naive in a couple ways. I was naive in that I, deferred to a two-state solution, which I've long since realized is just an absurdity and a kind of move to prevent equality. So that's one way. Nevertheless, the paper did really well and I felt really validated. So anyways, my experience since then to now in not just this subject, but almost all subjects is, everybody thinks they're an expert. Everything's debatable and up for grabs. And it's disappointing because I see the whole discourse and the whole world kind of moving sideways and moving backwards, and, electing Donald Trump in 2016, and Bernie Sanders is a Jew. You could have had a relatively progressive Jew, handling these sorts of issues. And there's forces beyond the presidency even, but, we would be in a different world and a different trajectory. So just a little quick overview, right, of Norman Finkelstein and Alan Dershowitz. Sorry for all the text, and some of it has typos, but Alan Dershowitz defended Jeffrey Epstein in 2008. And this is another thing I actually missed at the time, because I wrote my paper in early 2009, and I wasn't, aware of all the details going on. And I was focused on their relationship to this issue, not that wider context. But and Norman Finkelstein's not perfect, but he's a forensic political scientist. He does incredible work. He's written about the Holocaust industry and instrumentalization. And the book that I based my work on with him was actually a reply to Dershowitz and a debunking of Dershowitz, called Beyond Chutzpah. This is all this conflict, which goes on to this day, and between many other people and many other, like Bassem Youssef against Dershowitz. Many people have conflicts with them. It speaks to, one person is protecting power and the status quo, and frankly, a kind of Jewish supremacy, and claiming to speak for Jews, while the anti-Zionist Jew side suffers career blockage and attacks, and there's a lot of cost to that. So I've tried to put these slides in order, and this is so it builds, and this is a very high level overview. But I'm trying to show here that clearly Jewish politics is not one thing. There's a real split between Zionist hegemony and anti-Zionist Jewish dissent. And it's become so polarized and extreme at this point that the Zionists point at the anti-Zionist side and say, you're crazy, you're self-hating, you don't matter, you're marginal, and this is it. We're finishing the Zionist project. We're plowing Gaza. We're building resorts. This is the Witkoff-Kushner plan. And I don't have a slide for that, but I wanted to mention the Witkoff-Kushner plan somewhere, at least, because they admitted in an interview that they've had these master plans, as they say, for 2 years. And that lines up with, October of 2023, if not before. Just like the Project for a New American Century had plans for the Middle East and to do regime change in Iraq prior to 9/11, there's a long-term agenda here. And again, it relates to Christian nationalism in the U.S. and Christian Zionism, because they have a plan. They are currently trying to make the United States a Christian nation in a sort of fascistic Christian nationalist project. And there's so many billionaires involved with that project. We should be very frightened. So I argue flattening the Jews is itself a key part of the problem, right? And who gets to be heard, and how do both of those groups relate to the public, and how do they relate to each other? And how are they so diametrically opposed? And I want to get concrete about it. Here's an example, a list. The pro-Israel Zionist power block of Jewish elites, right? These are Jewish Zionists. No Christian Zionists are on this list, but their combined wealth is in the trillions. And they control major corporations, very, particular ones like Meta, for example, right? TikTok, of course, being taken over. Larry Ellison's trying to buy Warner Brothers, right? This isn't the Jews control everything, clearly, but it's that billionaires control a lot, and they have Zionist assumptions. And then the Jewish anti-Zionist dissent bloc, right? And this is present, but again, this is a long-standing thing. They are philosophers, historians, journalists, right? They're typically going to be like medium income, they're going to have a much lower net worth. Katie Halper down at the bottom, she's one of my favorite journalists in this regard specifically, but just in general. I don't think we see and foreground enough this kind of schism. And the New York Times is typically firmly on one side of this debate, and at best, they'll present a kind of muddy nuance, right? And they have various de facto Zionists. Like, there's a big difference, I would say, between kind of a liberal Zionist and an ultra Zionist, right? But they will both work with whoever's in power. And there are liberal Zionists like Ezra Klein, David Brooks, who work for the New York Times, write for them, that constantly present a kind of both sides argument and kind of, undermine the issue and don't give enough voice to this anti-Zionist side. And frankly, my perspective on almost all discourse over the last 20 years has been very low visibility for critics and dissidents, especially critics of people, right? Like critics of David Brooks, critics of Ezra Klein. Those guys will be like, who? I'm being critiqued? Oh my God. Like they don't engage with it, and you have Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates speak on this issue. And it's painful to watch because there's such an aloofness and a naivete of Ezra Klein and just a failure to reckon with radicalism. I have much bigger lists, Ben Shapiro on the left there. His personal net worth is 50 to 60 million. There's just a lot of money. And I want people to understand that when we think about how discourse is shaped, comes pre-shaped to us. So this is my hottest take slide, not to offend anybody, but just it comes on the heels of, Jewish politics is not one thing, right? So when it comes to Netanyahu and his claim to speak for all Jews, right? My hot take is Netanyahu is as Jewish as Hitler was Catholic. And given his arrest warrants, given his track record going back to the 90s, right, you have to understand criticizing Netanyahu should be easy, even from within Israel. Because Netanyahu fomented the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 95. He was blamed for that by Israelis. He didn't pull the trigger, but he was blamed for that. And then he swept into power. I do have a slide on this later. It might be a little bit out of order. So I'll come back to Netanyahu and the kind of political capture of Israeli society. But just trying to show here, again, within religion, there's all these splits. You can't flatten Islam to Islamism, to radical Islam, which someone like Sam Harris tends to do. You can't flatten Christianity, as convenient as it would be, right? There are all the mega churches and the Heritage Foundation that are very dogmatic, that wield enormous power. They have almost nothing in common with liberation theology and liberation Christians, progressive Christians. So the faith claim does not equal the state doctrine. And it raises the question of, well, what are these things even? What are these identities? What are these cultures? And how are they weaponized? Right. So Hitler was raised Catholic. It's something he weaponized And of course, the Catholic Church today would denounce that, just like they denounce Peter Thiel. Anti-Zionist Jews are not an anomaly. They are a minority today, but that's not always been the case. They are a historical fact. They're a present reality. And it's a key point of political intervention and contesting the feedback engine that keeps this issue stuck and ongoing. And from Zionists, you hear a lot of the claim that it is the right to Jewish self-determination, that it's the right to a Jewish state. But that's only half of the picture, right? And anti-Zionist Jews are not going against their own interest when they say, well, we don't want a Jewish state. We want a secular state. And I'll get to that too. And this next slide helps clarify that. Jewish safety does not equal Zionist state power, and vice versa. The fear is real. The historical fear, the trauma of World War II, the displacement, the persecution throughout time, as well as in World War II. And I will never deny anything about the Holocaust, but 80 million people died. So when we talk about 6 million, the context of 6 million Jews in the context of 80 million, it's much bigger, right? And the Soviet Union lost 30 million people. So we should mourn the broader loss of life and, the tragedy of war in general, that it doesn't need to happen. And I'm not a World War II expert by any means, but I think we're continuing to deconstruct all of history and revise all of history to figure out what really happened, what really went wrong, and what's going wrong today. So the historical fear leads to a false solution. A state claiming to speak for all Jews presents permanent ethno-state, in part, its identity state power as the answer. And that leads to paradoxical outcomes. That binding of Jewish identity, which anti-Zionist Jews don't consent to, actually feeds back into anti-Semitism, making Jews less safe, not more. I should say too, quickly before I move on from this, something that may jump out, and I'd have to measure this, but I think by and large this tracks with left-right politics as well. So a lot of the billionaires, they'll be on the political right, and they'll be sponsoring propaganda that encourages right-wing politics, even though a lot of anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories about Jews are coming from the right-wing voter base. But they'll still vote right. They'll still vote for this. And the Jewish anti-Zionist bloc is largely left-wing activists. And so in the broader sense, right, we have an enormous asymmetry in society and public discourse where, there's a feeling that leftists dominate academia and all this, the long march of institutions and wokeness is like dominant. But it's not dominant. It's emergent. And the left is actually very suppressed and repressed. Coming from these paradoxical outcomes, this is just a general framing of, the claims to the land itself. And you might hear sometimes people say like, well, no state has a right to exist. Like, it's all socially constructed. First and foremost, like Canada, where I am, doesn't have a right to exist. It was a colonial project. How do I reconcile that? How do we move forward from that? Right. So this is a global problem. Who has claim to what land? And it is solvable. We just have to be really mature and solidaristic and, consolidate a progressive politics that enables change. But in the context of Israel-Palestine, it is quite asymmetrical, and that's the theme I'm going to be exploring for the rest of this session. How asymmetrical is it? Well, in terms of movement, Israeli Jews have free movement on protected roads, and Palestinians, by and large, have to go through checkpoints, walls, have permits, be blockaded, especially in the case of Gaza, which no longer exists, really. law, right, on the Israeli side. Just like in America, law is very overdetermined. It largely serves the elites. There is a lot of due process and state protection, but it's also can be hacked. And in fact, before the war started, the current war on Gaza, Netanyahu was being prosecuted by his own Supreme Court, right? That's like, imagine if the Supreme Court in the United States were trying to take down Trump, which they're not. They're stacked right wing, but imagine that. They were trying to take down Netanyahu for his corruption. And again, he's been in power for 20, 30 years. So Israeli society is divided. And then that law also ends up serving military rule, detention, unequal process. The land, settlement growth, title security, expansion versus the experience of Palestinians is expropriation, demolition, enclosure, different access to water infrastructure, different access to security, and perhaps most importantly, different access to a political horizon. Like, what are your hopes? What are our pathways? Israelis have the idea of sovereignty that to them is immutable, an idea of permanence. They have so much leverage, and Palestinians have fragmentation and managed precarity. And one thing I'll touch on too with this term apartheid, when South Africa was apartheid, Israel was a supporter and an ally and an investor in the apartheid project. When apartheid ended in South Africa, since then, they've taken a critical view of Israel. That's why South Africa has been the one to bring the case to the ICJ. But I don't want us to get hung up on the terms too much. Like genocide itself, there is broadly a consensus from genocide experts and humanitarian organizations, but the mere fact that there's still Palestinians left means that it can't be a genocide. But I would point to the legal definitions and the idea of acts of genocide. So again, I'm trying to move this discussion into a realm of simplicity and realism that looks at the facts on the ground and not the discourse per se, because the discourse is very polarized, very contentious, littered with disinformation. The question is not whether Jews deserve safety or even a special kind of safety, but what kind of state claims to provide it. Right. So the abstract claim of people deserve security, trauma shapes political memory, and collective protection matters. This should apply to everybody, Palestinians equally. But the actual form is exclusive. It's expansionist. Various parts are under occupation, under siege. And that security state, again, just like in the United States, does not really appease or protect any citizens. It makes everybody feel less safe, which makes them easier to control and manipulate. So we don't want to confuse the abstract claim with the actual form of the state, its historical formation and its present formation. And this is related when a state claims to speak for all Jews. Representation becomes a shield, and the shield becomes impunity. Jews who reject Zionism disappear from view. Palestinians confronting a state project are recoded as threatening Jews, as is the wider world. Like, I become embroiled in that when I advocate for Palestinian liberation. I'll quickly, I don't have a slide for this either, but quickly want to talk about the term anti-Semitism, because it's deployed very carelessly, as Finkelstein writes books about. It's become a weapon and a bludgeon. But the term, it's very paradoxical, right? So I've been called anti-Semitic, even though I'm not. But bigger than that, it's kind of an incoherent term, because whatever order you want to put this in, Semitic is a family of languages that includes Arabic. So on the surface, it makes no sense to say anti-Semitic just to refer to Jew hatred. But the person who coined and promoted the term anti-Semitism was himself a Jew hater, was himself anti-Semitic. And yet, because it makes sense, everybody understands what we mean, we just keep using that same term. And I do argue frequently that a lot of misnomers in discourse are root levels of conflict and misunderstanding. So a bit of a pivot, just to zoom out, look at the long history, and I'll talk about each point a little bit. But again, the political Zionist project was well funded, was very exclusive and radical, and did not have the support of many Jews, and likely not a majority at the beginning, but it grew as a movement. And, the British controlled Palestine prior to Israel's formation, and that was its own kind of racist project that enabled a lot of settling. And some of that migration and integration with Palestine and Palestinians worked. There was a lot of hospitality and a lot of peaceful co-living. And by the way, when that region is not being manipulated, diverse peoples have always lived there: Jews, Christians, Muslims, throughout history, in different times of history, ahead of the fact that the Nakba and the state formation of Israel was preceded by Zionist terror groups, that then the leaders of those groups became the prime minister or president of Israel. And that's just kind of a shocking fact that we have to sit with, that not just that there was terrorism, but then they became the leaders and normalized that type of security state. 1967, the occupation expands. The 90s was management and perhaps well-intentioned but doomed peace talks. And as I said, like assassinations put an end to that hope. The 2000s, Gaza just gets worse, whether or not Israel is directly occupying it. And history is not a simple linear causal event. That's not what I'm trying to show with this kind of slide. But it's always contended. It's always an open horizon. But there are powerful forces in motion throughout time that increase the likelihood of certain outcomes. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Israel's nuclear weapons capacity and how that makes them unique in the world. So, for example, they first started secretly pursuing this project and stole yellowcake uranium from I think it was a French ship, kind of a conspiracy. I'm not going to go into the details there, but they stole all this yellowcake to start developing nuclear bombs. Kennedy pushed against that. He was maybe a hawk in some ways, but on this issue, he wanted to limit the intelligence agencies, to de-escalate the Cold War, and particularly to stop Israel from pursuing nuclear capability. And they didn't like that. Plumbat is the yellowcake hijacking I was talking about. 60s and 70s, opacity doctrine. They never officially admit they have a bomb, while, throughout time, certainly alluding to it, certainly making threats with it. And throughout this time, they have assassinated and abducted various people related to this. The double standards, and if you've heard the term the Samson option, that's their rhetoric of threatening the world, that if you cross us, we will, deploy nukes, while also scapegoating Iran and saying they're the problem and they're pursuing nuclear weapons. So that's a way it also builds to the current conflict happening there. So this is an important one. I was talking about the assassination, but in a broader sense, the left hollowing out, right? And this happens in the United States too. So there's a political delegitimization against the left and the peace camp. Dissent lacks power to reverse the regime's direction, especially post 9/11. And again, globally, right? The US creates the war on terror. Netanyahu is there, the tail wagging the dog with the Iraq war, giving presentations at the UN. From then till now, he's still been allowed to do that somehow because of the US. And that leads us to our present moment, which is not just further Israel impunity, right? And by the way, right now, they're further invading and bombing Lebanon. It leads to an imperative for redesign. And that could be a talk in itself. So I'm just going to move on. This is probably the hardest slide to swallow in some ways. The asymmetry did not begin on October 7th. Obviously, certain things were catalyzed and triggered on October 7th. And it was a very horrific day, and much has been said about it, and that, even as horrible as it is, Netanyahu should have resigned on October 8th because he in part fomented this. But anyway, the numbers matter, right? It's not a competition for who's suffering more, but 1,200 Israelis were killed, including civilians and IDF soldiers. Since then, roughly 70,000 Palestinians have been confirmed killed. All innocent as far as I'm concerned. This isn't, we got to get Hamas kind of thing. Because as you'll see in further slides, there's so much just destruction of everything, of water, of land, of trees. The trees are not Hamas. So 170,000 Palestinians injured. Now, look to the left, the before October 7th slide. The population in the West Bank is roughly Palestinians to Israelis 4-1. But the fatality ratio is 20-1. The injury ratio is 25-1. So even if you don't think that that's a huge overcorrection, it shows the asymmetry of violence proportional to the population size before October 7th. And this is data from 2008 to 2023. With that in mind, right, there's also 2.1 million people displaced, 500,000 in catastrophic hunger, 700,000 tons of bombs dropped, creating 61 million tons of rubble. So somewhere I have the cost of that. It's something like $60 billion is what that cost to do. That money was spent, through the military industrial complex. And so it's a fusion trap in the sense that, tying Jewish safety to the Jewish state leads to that justification and the perception globally, because Zionists are promoting that conflation that Jews are somehow doing this when it's more complicated than that, which leads to various types of backlash. And then the Zionists cite that backlash, that it's proof that the state is necessary. And again, just to zoom out from an international relations perspective, all of this is very uncreative and unjust. There's better ways to solve these problems and to redesign political systems. And democracy is largely hijacked. That's why we're stuck in a loop. And again, not just in Israel, in the West at large. 120,000 structures completely destroyed. 81% of structures hit. 77% of roads damaged or destroyed. This is in Gaza. 97% of tree crops, 68% of cropland. Within the first few weeks, Hiroshima level bomb tonnage was exceeded in Gaza. So it's the systemic destruction of everything. And again, the really scary thing, without even being in any way conspiratorial, is that the Witkoff-Kushner plan was like even before, but at the time, okay, this is our moment, guys, to build our luxury resort, $100 billion development project. And well, I guess we're going to have to clear the way to make that happen. And I almost pity them, because I rather than attribute just pure malice, I don't think they know what they're doing and how bad it is. And that's why Israel is losing in the court of public opinion, and they're losing their resources. And the American empire has been declining and crumbling for a long time. So these are very misguided efforts, whatever our opinions are. Israel's global footprint. We could talk about other forces, right? Countervailing forces. But that's not, the lead here. The thesis that needs to be highlighted is what Israel does. And obviously Israel has lots of great things it creates and innovates. But it's a trap to get into measuring the good against the bad, right? We need to decolonize the entire world so there's no exploitation in the Congo. So there's no saber rattling at Iran. So there's no assassinations and covert ops all over Europe and United States, as there has been. So that APAC is not there as a siphon and a consolidation arm of money just to reify the Israel project. And just again, the broader point of how held captive and how deprived of oxygen our political imagination is. Lots of people are very cynical. They don't believe peace is possible. They don't believe a redesign of politics is possible, because that's what we've been programmed to think. There was another thing, it's maybe not articulated on the slide, but the IDF trains various police forces in the world. They train the New York Police Department. They've trained with some in Canada. Israel, of course, has this birthright trip for anyone who's a Jew, and you can convert to Judaism. And it's a bit of a revolving door with police in some of these organizations as well. That mentality and that method of militarized police to contain publics and ostensibly solve problems, but I think they're creating way more problems than they solve. This is a military industrial complex thing, it's not a Jewish thing. And again, going back to the asymmetry I'm talking about, Zionist versus anti-Zionist Jews, and then the wider frame, Christians, I feel like part of the solution necessarily lies in exposing that asymmetry and that internal contradiction, so that the journalists being killed, the writers and pundits being ignored, can be heard, and that broadly speaking, the sort of the international consensus and the global movements of decolonial projects and environmentalists and feminists and everything, where all that converges, and protests globally, people need to see that. The more they see of it, the more that can be empowered. So public sentiment is shifting. It shifts all sorts of ways all the time, and it's in motion. But a majority of Americans certainly do not support what's happening. And I think the more informed they are, and hopefully the way I'm presenting it contributes to that informing and that demystifying of this topic, that the more they can change their minds and converge and not vote the same power structures back into power. So it is a machine that all these things feed into each other. I'm very close to the end here, so I'm going to skip through some of these. The state, this one's a little more clear. The state power controls the Palestinian reality. And both of those influence the public opinion field and the diaspora institutions, APAC, namely, which overwhelmingly, disproportionately influence Western governments and say, this is how it is, you got to support us. And media and academia is contentious, influenced by both, but it's not controversial. Mass media is dominated by that billionaire class and that normalization of that discourse. And that, heightened state of insecurity all the time feeds right back into the military security bloc and, just sort of a endless faucet of money for weapons while other things are being cut. Welfare, education, healthcare, infrastructure, everything else is cut. But the military industrial complex gets a blank check. And so these are loops. They reproduce themselves through security loops, narrative loops, patronage loops, and it distorts our perception. The politics of domination is sustained by a politics of interpretation and the language of exceptionalism, of moral inversion, of taboo management, and of compression, right? The flattening of these histories leads to an official frame over the visible reality. The official frame of self-defense, security, the complexity of the conflict, the inevitability, no partner for peace, rhetoric, overwhelms and smothers and obscures what is a very visible reality. That we can all look it up. It comes into our feeds one way or another, of displacement, collective punishment, expansion, settlement expansion. And by the way, just to quickly go back to this slide, let's say, there's a lot of war crimes going on here. It's not just a war. It's literally more war crimes than can be kept up with, than can be prosecuted. So it distorts perception, and then criticism gets neutralized. Public critique gets misrepresented and filtered through that conflation. Critique of Zionism is reframed as hatred. That goes through the platform filters. That contributes to institutional chill. A lot of academics are afraid to speak up. That leads to a sort of managed debate, a kind of theater, complexities rituals, both sides containment. And these filters convert the moral shock into managed stasis, endless war, and no policy shift, right? So policies are delayed. There's symbolic concern, continued impunity, and performative civility. And so we got to get away from the false binary, the false choice between Jews or Palestinians. Anti-Zionist Jews know, and Palestinian advocates know, that it's not either or, it's both and, it's collaborative, it's open. And so the onus is on us. We have a responsibility to depolarize and de-escalate the discourse, these issues, and to advocate aggressively for demilitarization and for peace building. And that's very different from a peace process that has always been captured, right? So it's a very tall order to emancipate ourselves from these traps that I'm saying are connected in my earlier slide about how my talks relate: paradigm drift and systemic conspiracy, and then next communism. It's like swimming upstream to even gain literacy in these topics. So the trap is that the assumption that it's protecting Jews by defending a state that claims to act in their name, and the counterclaim is protecting Palestinians by confronting those state structures harms them, harms everybody. Jews and Palestinians are both endangered when safety is built on supremacy, siege, expulsion, and endless war. So and we can reject the political form without saying both sides of the problem, whether left and right or, Zionist and anti-Zionist. We can reject the political form of the Jewish state because it has never been that safe and functional. I think more and more people are waking up to this, but it's very costly to wake up. So what I've tried to do to see it clearly and kind of take us in a cumulative pathway, name the structure, refuse the moral inversion, reconnect and revise these various histories, rebuild institutions, defend open critique, and consolidate a peace bloc. This is still a very complex and tenuous process. It's interpersonal, it's very macro-systemic, because there is a machine running 24/7, and it's overdetermined, and it harms even the Jews involved in it. Again, the IDF have the highest suicide rates in the world because they are Israeli citizens are conscripted. They have to serve. They are indoctrinated from birth in this security exceptionalist state mentality. And then with any war, like serving in the U.S. military, going to the Iraq war, you are confronted by the reality that these things do not make sense. So it's a conspiracy even against soldiers and veterans, frankly. They just become grist for the mill. So I research and talk about de-Zionization as a process, and it's can be framed as transition, not reversal. And it involves relearning all this stuff about Zionism, anti-Zionism, post-Zionism, and how money is controlling that discourse, leading us into very thought-terminating cliches about what these words mean. But it's a process, just like denazification was a process after World War II. De-Zionization can be a process that's alive right now. Rejecting the supremacist doctrine. You know, we have to agree on that to move towards ending it. And again, that includes the United States. End the occupation, the siege, and the settlement. And this is a very hard thing to do, very tall order. And just a point about, you know, being involved with progressive activism and anti-war protests and decolonial work. It often feels like it's a lost cause. It's triage. You know, we're not really stopping the machine. Literally, the tank or the steamroller will drive over you. Equal rights, one civic standard. Now, there's claims that this exists in Israel and elsewhere, but it hardly exists anywhere. So, equal rights, unified legal horizon, movement, land, speech, access to water, food, education. That is the foundation for safety and security of all people, because people by and large do not want war. Step 4, return, right of return, repair, accountability, a truth and reconciliation process, right, which followed the Holocaust. It followed South Africa's abolition. It's something that's has happened and is ongoing here in Canada with respect to the Indigenous genocide. And it's something the United States has never done in any formal or substantial way. So we're still living and beholden to this Cold War zeitgeist. And behind that is a nuclear arsenal. And behind that is literally insane people and scared people and powerful people that have said, we need to do this. We need nuclear weapons. And so there's a kind of cascade of causation that becomes like a tsunami. You know, you cannot get out of the way of it. It kind of determines everything. If we can do this, we can have a shared secular future, democratic coexistence, beyond racial theology and theocracy, beyond militarized rule. And then so finally, this is just the last slide, I guess. It's related. De-Zionization is not hatred. It's the beginning of repair. It means dignity for Palestinians. It means stability and reflexivity for Jews. And for the world, it means we're getting on the path to reform. It's the end of catastrophic exceptionalism. So, yeah, I didn't even look at any of my notes. I probably missed a lot. There's always a lot more to say. That's just a very kind of slow-walked overview. Maybe So I'll say a couple more things, but generally, feel free to put your hand up if you want to speak. This term Israelpolitik has been used by other people and clarified in ways that dovetail with exactly what I'm trying to highlight. This is an example. This book is called The Road to Iraq, but the reviewer is calling their approach Israelpolitik. It's about the neocons, right? And the long shadow of the Iraq War. Pax Palestina, this term has been developed by various people. It's something that I'm trying to understand and expand on and build on. And again, like, didn't even mention Orientalism. There's just so many things. Weaponized victimhood. Who's suffering more, that compound and reify this endless war. So thank you. I hope you all got something from that, and that we can have a discussion. You can ask me anything. You can challenge me. I've debated Zionists. That's something I'd like to share and talk about as well. But not today. There just wasn't time to fit in all those things, and what my experience has been like, and what the analysis of those debates shows, and are they even real debate when they're so contrived and people are coming in just to argue?